This week on the Woven Energy Podcast.
One of the ways the Miasma works is through finding problems that don't actually exist in the real world and then offering socially dominating solutions to those problems. My warnings about psychoactive substances, catalysts as I call them, let's talk about how they work a little bit. You and I could sit and we could do just as many episodes on the Miasma as we've done on Shamanism. It would be the most depressing podcast probably on the internet. We've also inadvertently developed brains that can visualize other things that have no reality in the real world. And a mortgage is an abstraction. It's something we've invented in our brains. Money itself is an abstraction. We create physical money. Things I remember when I was 18, I'll tell you now, there is no way I was an adult when I was 18. No way. A very large part of that is actually the miasma. Things that I think are coming out of me, but actually they're things that I've been taught to be. You will not achieve enlightenment instantly. That will not happen. It just won't. But shamanism is absolutely not about imagining and inventing things. Shamanism is about deriving knowledge, wisdom, insight into the real world that provides you with an advantage over somebody who doesn't have that insight.
Well, here we are. We are back with another episode of the Woven Energy Podcast. I'm Joseph Sikora, and I'm here once again with Damon Smith to talk about shamanism from the ground up. So the last few episodes have been on the topic of animism, and I can genuinely say that it's been a huge eye-opener for me. They've been my favourite episodes so far and kind of touched on some new ideas and concepts which I hadn't really thought about before. So I'm sure Damon would say that it's all, but it's all on the baseline, Joe. Anyway. There is probably a lot more to explore here in future episodes, but I thought, particularly as we discussed the events last episode and the chaos and kind of bullshit they had to go through, that it's a good time to dedicate an episode or two to what we call the miasma. Now, we've talked about the miasma a few times over the course of the podcast and talked a little bit about it, but we haven't really gone majorly in depth as to what it is and how fundamentally important it is to overcome or understand, to progress with our shamanism or our shamanism if it's going to mean anything. It's there. It's been affecting us since we were born into this what we call civilised society. Now, remember, up until very recently, like 12,000 years ago, we led lives that were intertwined with the realities of nature. If we weren't, we'd simply die. We live in a very different environment now than what we used to do. So again, this is kind of new to me. So I'm going to pass you over to Damon to take us through what the miasma is and how it's so important in our pursuit of real practical shamanism. So Damon, let's start with an overview of this concept. What is the miasma?
Gosh, that's about the trickiest question there is. One of the things I think we mentioned with the miasma is that our language has been constructed as in such a way that it makes it very difficult for us to see the miasma. It kind of the nature and structure of the language that we use kind of points us away from it or faces us away from it, and this is more than just simply the language not just having a word for it. I mean, we talked about, the languages of animistic peoples. They tend to have a word for it. Mongols got Tiran, the Siberian words, Ehru. Japanese even has Hokori, Shiki, and I believe in Aboriginal it's called Ihwa or something like that. But this is more than just the fact that we don't have a word for it.
So you're saying other cultures have words for it and go further than that, have many words for it?
Absolutely. When I say other cultures, I'm talking about animistic, shamanistic cultures. I don't believe that other settled, civilized cultures have words for it. I'm not an expert on French or German or anything like that, but,
You're educated guess.
I'm not so an educated guess, yeah. So, one of the construction of our language makes it very, very difficult to talk about. So one of the techniques I think that we mentioned that's been used to explain shamanistic topics, shamanistic ideas, is the use of allegory and inference. Historically, I think you mentioned the wonderful work known as the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, and esoteric work. they uses allegory in a big way to describe effectively the process of becoming a shaman. Those techniques we could use, that particular work, which I think is probably one of the most underrated works of world literature. It relies on the fact that whoever wrote it, we're not entirely sure who that was. There were some good ideas. Was a phenomenally clever person, phenomenally clever in terms of the use of allegory. The technique that's worked better for me with yourself and with other people who I've tried to help with shamanism and in terms of helping them to understand the miasma is simply to give lots and lots of examples. And what happens as I give examples, what we normally do, we give practical examples involving doing things. But on a podcast, they're going to have to be descriptive baseline type of examples. But what happens is each one of the examples or each one of the descriptions or definitions, I have loads of definitions of the miasma. Each one of the descriptions or definitions is not quite right. It's not the miasma, but what emerges out of that kind of activity is the person concerned starts to see it. They start to see that underlying these things that are being presented to them or that in normal shamanic training they're engaging in, underlying those things is something else, something that's an impetus behind them. And that thing that you can't put into words, you can't quite put it into words, is the miasma. So what I propose to do is just start randomly giving you some definitions of the miasma. The loss is much less of an issue for real shamans in real animistic communities. You go back, 20,000 years to a animistic shamanistic community. Those guys have a little bit of a miasma. We talked about stuff like, rites of passage and, initiation ceremonies and things that people have to go through that keep their society in a certain order. It's like a miasma light, but it's nothing compared to what we've got. So what I would say is, as settled civilized people learning shamanism, we have a much bigger problem with the miasma than, in inverted commas, your average shaman would for the vast majority of human history. So let me, and also the miasma, we've been working on it quite a long time. We've been working on this since we invented agriculture. Or even slightly before that, we talked about pastoralism.
So it's a lot stronger for us.
It's big, it's complex, its action is very, very subtle in many cases. Sometimes it's unsubtle, which we'll go into. But it's it is very, very strong for us. And one of the biggest difficulties, I think going back to the first podcast, one of the biggest difficulties for me as a member of settled society trying to understand the miasma is a big part of that miasma used to be, and possibly still is, a big part of what I call me or what I call I. When I say the word I, I'm half referring to me and I'm half referring to a very large part of the miasma. So when something is so closely identified with you, it makes it very, very difficult to see. So as we go on, you'll see I start giving historical examples of the miasma.
What you were just talking about, though, does that mean when you were saying large part of what you say as you or me, what you feel like you identify with? What I
identify as. I mean, I don't mean what I identify with. I mean what I identify as.
I am that
person.
who.
Yeah, I'm the kind of person who. Yeah, I'm that kind of person. I think that, I believe that. It's my opinion that all of this, a very large part of that, I wouldn't say all of it, but a very large part of that is actually the miasma. Things that I think are coming out of me, but actually they're things that I've been taught to be. That's probably the best way.
The lenses we view the world through. Our paradigms.
That have come from external sources to myself that are also external sources to the natural world. Yeah. So it's probably, I mean, we could go on like this for ages. And I was talking to one of our friends today, who's one of my more experienced, one of the people who've been with me the longest in terms of learning shamanism. And he said, we were sort of jokingly saying that alongside the Woven Energy podcast, we could start whole other podcast just on the Miasma. There is so much material there. And he suggested we call it the Messed Up Energy Podcast. I'm pretty sure that was a joke. But actually, on the serious side, there is enough material for that. You and I could sit and we could do just as many episodes on the Miasma as we've done on shamanism. It would be the most depressing podcast probably on the internet, but there is enough material there. So let me kick off. Let me kick off by giving you a few definitions, if you like. So we've talked about our obsession with the tam, the roots of the world tree. And one way of looking at the miasma is it's partly the results of having done that for 10,000 years, building layer upon layer upon our spirit, upon ourselves, our obsession with the baseline, the way that we think we've understood the world simply by analyzing it, rather than, if you like, participating in it or being part of it. The miasma falls out of that. That puts us in a situation where we can hold things to be real, hold things to be true, that are actually not real and not true, but we think they are. We feel that they are. And our linkage between language and visualization and our perception of the world is somewhat too strong. So, for instance, we create words for things, we create concepts for things. I mentioned Freudian concepts, the id and the ego. Most people talk as if they're real things, when there's no scientific basis for that. There's no evidence that they exist. They're just things that become so established in our consciousness that they become real. And sometimes this is useful. But what I would say is that there's actually a biological basis for this. If you think what we had to do as effectively apes who came down from the trees, we had to, as we've said, we had to develop our shamanism. Our shamans had to develop our technology and our strategy and our closeness to nature, our neoteny, if you want to use that word, the way we explore things. They had to develop all of that to such a high level that it would protect us from the other things that were already down there on the ground. They were a lot better at being on the ground than us. Lions are the example we've used, but there are lots of other other animals. We had to develop our shamanism to the point where it could protect us to a strong enough extent that we were safe down there on the ground after we came down from the trees, and we started to use tools. For instance, the first tools we made were simply shaped pieces of rock, flint, for instance. So we got into what we now call flint napping, which is where you take a piece of, not just flint, but any type of rock that has a very predictable fracture pattern. And we would take a piece of rock and we'd hit it with another piece of rock, and that would knock off a shard. And this is quite a skilled thing. I've tried doing flint napping and learned that skill. You think it's going to be easy when you start, and then you have a go at it. It's a very, very skilled process. But the point with flint napping is that to create sophisticated tools, I don't know if you've seen any of the, especially the Neolithic tools, that were made out of stone, phenomenal artwork that's basically made by knocking pieces of rock together. The beautiful, smooth arrowheads and axes and spear points. They look like some machinery's been used, but actually the thing has been made by simply knocking pieces of rock together. The issue with that type of tool making is that you need to analyze, that there's an analysis, there's baseline activity. I knock a shard off a piece of flint. I need to then look at the remaining stone and analyze and determine where my next shard is going to come off. I'm dealing with the results. Remember, we talked about what the results of what have gone before. So this tool making activity that we got very, very good at, that caused our physiology and our brains to start to develop in an unusual way. And visualization is important. We had to be able to visualize what we wanted to happen with that piece of rock. We're effectively sculpting, where like a sculptor visualizes what he wants to happen with that piece of rock. We're engaging in baseline activity, but for a completely legitimate reason. This is not the miasma. This is a legitimate use of the baseline. Remember, we did say there are legitimate uses of the roots of the tree, of the tam. Totally.
It has its time,
exactly.
It has its place.
But because visualization, for one reason and another, became so important to us, this actually created a physiological effect in our brains, or physical effect in our brains. And the example of that I'm going to give is just one of several things that changed in us because of our new and somewhat strange, excessive tool use, our strange way of living. We had to analyze these things as we were creating them. I work with the results of what had gone before a lot more than other animals. And there's a thing called the lunate sulcus, which is a fold or fissure in the brains of primates, of apes that are close relations. So chimpanzees and bonobos, we've talked about a lot, they have this lunate sulcus. And the lunate sulcus is a physical gap or barrier between the part of the brain that's concerned with visualization and the part of the brain that deals with the rest of that animal's life, i.e. reality. And the lunate sulcus is very, very marked in all of the apes that are closely related to us, all of them. So what that's saying is that the visualization, the handling of vision is quite clearly differentiated from their perception of reality. What I mean is, it's just a tool to them. It's on the whole, it's just a tool. The visual part of the brain reflects reality very directly and very immediately. And that has, of course, it influences the rest of the brain, but it's not merged in with the other higher functions of the brain that might be involved in what we would come to call imagination. What's very, very interesting with the brains of humans is, of course, this lunate sulcus has actually physically disappeared, or virtually disappeared. And so compared to our closest relatives, our visual, the way we deal with visualization is more distributed throughout the rest of the brain and has more influence on other areas of the brain, to the point where we can create stuff in our brains that is not real, and yet we perceive it as real. When that is a piece of rock in our mind, a piece of rock, a beautiful arrowhead that's going to be far more effective than any rubbishy old arrowhead that's made by just making a flint flick. Yeah, a beautifully effective arrowhead for hunting. When that vision is used, or that visualization is used for that kind of legitimate purpose, then that's great. It made us very effective. It was part of our shamanism. It's part of what enabled us to come down from the trees. The problem is, having developed brains that can do that, we've also inadvertently developed brains that can visualize other things that have no reality in the real world, and that are, if you like, detrimental to us as a people, as a species, and we can imagine they are real. So a good example of that would be stress response. Okay, the human physiology, stress response. Your heart beats faster, various hormones are released, adrenaline, so various hormones released into your bloodstream, your body's ready for action. Stress response it is a useful skill. It has legitimate applications. For instance, you're walking along and a lion pounces out of and goes for you. Yeah, pounces out of the long grass and goes for you. You need to move fast. You're probably not going to outrun it. You need to bring your spear to bear very quickly.
To bear, to action. Yeah.
Of course, that's totally legitimate. But now if we take the same thing and you see how the miasma, how about stress response over the fact that you can't pay your mortgage? Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? And from if I went back 20,000 years and we told a member of a hunter-gatherer society to please be stressed over the fact that he hasn't paid his mortgage, he's going, what is a mortgage? What is this thing of which you speak? And where could I hunt one? Yeah. A mortgage is an abstraction. It's something we've invented in our brains. Money itself is an abstraction. We create physical money, but on physical money that I promise to pay the bearer. I can't remember whether it's the Queen or the head of the Bank of England promises to bear the bearer on demand, but somebody promises bearer. But actually, it's just a piece of paper, right? It's an abstraction. And sometimes those abstractions have been useful to us. You could argue that, in a materialistic society, money as an abstraction has been useful to us if that's the kind of society we want to build. But there are certainly places where this ability of the brain to invent things that don't actually exist, but then go on to have a massive negative impact on our lives. So let me give you some examples of exactly that. One of the ways the miasma works is through finding problems that don't actually exist in the real world and then offering socially dominating solutions to those problems. So just suppose there is a people who identify themselves in some way in our society, and I, as a leader of this particular society, I'm looking for some social leverage over which that I can use to dominate my society and get my will done. I'm one of the agricultural surplus controllers, or their descendants, if you like. And I create this idea that there's something wrong with that particular group of people. There's something innately unpleasant or unsavory about them. And I then use that, so it's complete rubbish. I've just invented it out of nowhere. But I then use that because the other people in the society, can visualize that thing, even though I've invented it and it's not real. They can then latch onto that, believing that it's real, especially if I'm a charismatic individual, and we end up with Hitler's final solution, which is just about the best example of the miasma that I can think of. The miasma, or the people who want to leverage the miasma, remember I said that when I use the term black shaman, I'm referring to shamans who use shamanism in a harmful way. When we come on to Mongolian Buddhism, we'll find another meaning for the term black shaman, which is more anthropologically correct, meaning black shaman. But evil shamans, if you like, that's one of the ways they can, because they recognize the miasma and they recognize it as a tool that they can use, whereas the animistic populations that they're in, don't. And when we talked about can they hurt people, yes, they use the miasma to hurt people.
Well, is that related to, say, how, a very recent example in this country was the whole nonsense surrounding Brexit and leaving the EU, and you saw those debates, and it's just like how they talk to the masses and how everything's dumbed down and emotional and...
Yeah, but it didn't really work, did it? So the issue, but
it did work.
You see, they were trying. Well, it didn't. It depended on your point of view, But this is one of the other issues that I've had with this. It's a lot easier for me to use historical examples because people don't closely identify with those examples.
We can look at it. We can look at it with a fresh pair of eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. So the exact description I gave of Hitler's final solution, where he or the people around him invented this nonsense about somehow some people are inferior to other people, and used that as leverage as if it was real. Well, I'm afraid, in my opinion, the Christian concept of original sin falls squarely into that category as well. And you can look at for instance, you could, obviously the Spanish Inquisition, would be an example of that. But just on a general level, the number of people who beat themselves up over having sinful thoughts and being sinful because there's this general idea that, hey, people are sinful. And if you're not sinful, then there's something wrong with you, kind of thing. And you should be unhappy over that. There's another lesser example of that, because the Spanish Inquisition, on the other hand, that was full blown unpleasantness, again, on the basis of some fiction that's been invented, but people buy into it. In this case, the original sin. People buy into it. That would be an interesting one for us to talk about, what the Adam and Eve story, and stories like that, creation myths, in another podcast, what they mean, those things mean in shamanistic terms, which is very, very interesting. But here I'm talking about in exoteric terms only.
Yeah.
And so effectively, the fact that we're obsessed with the results of what's gone before, and the fact that visualization or imagination is so intimately connected with the other parts of our brains for completely different reasons, for originally very legitimate reasons, allows this kind of manipulation. And there's which you probably heard of, there's another way of looking at the miasma, which came from Terence McKenna. And he called it dominate a culture. So you can think, in one sense, you can think of the miasma as the negative or often unquestioned aspects of dominate a culture, that is, cultures that seek to dominate and control large numbers of people. Obviously, in hunter-gatherer societies, as we've said, they're small groups. They're not trying to dominate anybody on the whole. They're just enjoying their lives, But I've got a little quotation from McKenna, which I as I've said, probably my number one favorite book on shamanism is McKenna's Food of the Gods. Anyway, so this is the quotation. He says, as a species, we need to acknowledge the depth of our historical dilemma. We will continue to play with a half deck as long as we continue to tolerate cardinals of government and science who presume to dictate where human curiosity can legitimately focus its attention and where it cannot. I would love to put that sentence forwards, but to give an idea of what I feel the miasma is, I would add to it. Instead of saying, as long as we continue to tolerate cardinals of government and science, I would like to say, as long as we continue to tolerate cardinals of government, science, religion, and culture. So in a way, McKenna's idea of the dominator culture.
I think if he was around today, he would squarely agree with you about culture, at least.
Maybe so. Unfortunately, I never got to meet the guy. That would have been such an honour if that could have ever been achieved. But unfortunately, I didn't. Though I was very interested in this stuff while he was still alive,
Yeah.
So, in a way, dominator culture is one of the results of the miasma, or dominator culture also uses the miasma as if it's a tool. But if that book, Food of the Gods, I recommend that book to anybody. I think I said before that, McKenna was very, very interested in psychoactive substances. That was his academic interest. And the plants that contain them. So I would, the only caution it's a brilliant book. It's well researched. It's extremely well written. The only caution I would put on that book is there's more to shamanism than that. That's all.
Yeah. Well, it's written very academically as well, isn't it?
I don't know about that. I find it quite accessible, but that's a matter of opinion, There are, biochemical, which is one of the things McKenna raises in his book. There are biochemical aspects to the miasma as well. I think, as we've discussed already, agriculture led to us having markedly less varied diets. I think we contrast. I think we talked about today offering hunter-gatherers the chance to go and become farmers and have poorer diet, shorter life expectancy, and a lot harder work. It's not much of a tempting proposition. But it led to less varied diets, but it also led to radically different diets ultimately.
You're talking about grain?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And not just that, but hunter-gatherers, we said, eat live beetles, they'll eat anything, bless them. We are omnivores as a species. We're omnivores like bears and wild boars and so we'll pretty much eat anything going. And so hunter-gatherers they hunt and they gather and they hunt lots of different things and they gather lots of different things and different things at different times of year, and they have a very, very varied diet, and that's good for you. That's really good for you, In modern agriculture, there's quite a lot of variety. But remember that modern agriculture is extremely recent development, and it only applies to first world countries. But even so, even with that variety, there are still major changes from when we're hunter-gatherers. So McKenna talks about sucrose, which is a particular form of sugar. Sucrose is an unusual form of sugar in nature. It doesn't occur in very many places. Normally you get fructose or glucose. It obviously occurs in sugar cane and sugar beet, but really it's very, very rare. And there would be in the average hunter-gatherer, I'd say, you'd say there'd be virtually no sucrose in their diets. Yeah. But an average person in a modern first world country consumes about 70 kilograms of sucrose every year. And that's not counting the kind of refined carbohydrates like refined grains that you talked about, that highly refined forms that virtually turn into sugar as soon as they hit your stomach anyway, as soon as they hit the digestive system. Yeah. And McKenna kind of suggests, which I think would be a really, suggests, it doesn't go into huge detail on it, but he kind of views sucrose as a narcotic. You remember you were talking about that state that we're all in, yeah? There may be more to that, and my suspicion is there may be more to that than simply the miasma affecting us as we grow. My suspicion is that sucrose has some active role in this. So it's certainly if there was anybody involved in biochemistry that has the ability to research that idea, I think that would be a very, very interesting line of research.
Well, one thing's definitely for sure, and I can say this from my own experience: sugar is addictive, and some might say more addictive than the psychoactive substances that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's definitely addictive. There's no doubt about that. But you walk into a major supermarket today, and if you were, one of these massive places with loads and loads of different kinds of food, if you were to take out all the foods that are high in sugar and all the foods that are high in refined grains of rice, wheat, barley, all that kind of stuff, if we were to take all that stuff out of the shop, and then they would need a good deal smaller shop. They'd go from one of these huge superstores to a little corner shop. That's my view on that. You don't really have much of a choice. If you want to give up all forms and sources of sugar in your diet, or go back to the level of sugar that's in a hunter-gatherer diet, you're going to have lots of time on your hands, because you have to do all of your own cooking, and source all of your own food to do that. So you better not have a busy lifestyle. And B, you have to be so careful, because the stuff is virtually impossible. I would find it impossible to eat a diet without sugar in it.
To put it into perspective, I do remember there was one episode of that Bruce Parry's tribe. So I think you've seen it now. But there was one tribe, I forget the name, but they find some honey, or they find some natural form of sweet sugar-based food. And because it's so rare, they just go nuts over it.
Yeah.
Absolutely crazy. So it's, you know,
absolutely.
and we can go down to the store and get
and
it.
your brain is wired to reward you because, you know, you might find honey. You might find honey, you know. As a hunter-gatherer, there's a chance you're not going to find a lot of it, but when you do find it, that's good. That's lots of calories, which is what you need as a hunter-gatherer. But you're not living on it. That's the point. Because it's a rarity, because it's, if you like, a special treat, your brain rewards you big time, but you ain't going to be living on it because you ain't going to find enough of it. You know what I'm saying? So it's a very, very different thing. And also that's not going to be sucrose in that honey. Yeah. So it's unlikely to be sucrose in the honey. There are other biological things involved in the miasma. I think we said at some point in time I would like to get on to the biology behind shamanism, and some of the other science behind shamanism, because that, you know, in terms of my study of shamanism, that's been an extremely large part of it over many, many years. I have a lot to say about that. But I don't think it's useful at this point to, as I think I've said, that's a huge, colossal and multifaceted subject. Again, there's another podcast that we could run alongside with me. But maybe that one would be less depressing than the Messed Up Energy podcast. Yeah. But just briefly, there's a thing called myelin, which is, it's used in nerve cells in human beings. The neurons, they have kind of three major parts. There's the dendritic spines, or the dendrites. Now these, if you think of like it's an animal, you can think they're like its ears, it's listening for stuff. Yeah. And then there's the axon, which is the thing that actually transmits the nerve impulse to wherever it's going to go. So you think of actually some of these axons, even though they're single cells, can be ludicrously long. In whales, for instance, you can have axons that run all the way down the spine, you know, tens of feet long for a single cell. This is crazy. You know, people are probably aware that cells are microscopic things, yeah, and one that's tens of feet long is a bit of a weird concept, but this is possible. And neurons work in a very interesting way, which is very, very relevant to how shamanism works. A huge bearing, but again, I guess it's for a much later podcast. But briefly, if you think in terms of computers, you know, we have digital computers that work with ones and zeros. But then we also have analog devices like those old record players, you know, like the gramophone with the needle that reads the little troughs on the record and it goes up and down, but it's not like digital. It's like a wave. Yeah. The really interesting thing is single neuron is kind of analog at one end, the dendrites are like its ears, the things it's listening to the outside world, but it's digital at the other end. It's like a 1 or a 0. It's like a computer. The axon, the axon that comes out of it and transmits the nerve impulse, that's either on or it's off. And there's a thing called the action potential. So no one dendrite usually being stimulated. There can be like 10,000 dendrites on a single nerve cell. You know, that's why the brain's so complicated, the nervous system's so complicated. But no single dendrite will spark the neuron to do it from if you like, a 0 to a 1, from its resting potential to it into its action potential. There's like if you think of like a sea wall, and the sea gets higher and higher and higher, but behind the sea wall, nothing's happening. But then there could be lots of different things pushing water in behind the sea wall, wind and waves and what have you. But when it reaches the top of the wall, then it comes over. That's what the action potential is like on the axon. But axons by themselves, so these things that transmit all this stuff that we're interested in around our brains, you know. And around our nervous system and down our spine and make things happen, move muscles and all this kind of stuff. Once the axon does indeed get, you know, enough the activity happens on the dendrites that the axon's activated, the transmission speed in that axon's not that great. I've seen it. It could be as slow as 0.5 meter per second, which is pretty slow if you're a blue whale. So what nature has done is around the axons, it's developed this thing called a myelin sheath, which is just like putting an insulation cord around electrical wire. And this can speed up the transmission speeds big time, a myelinated axon transmission speed can be up to like 150 meters per second, which is crazy fast. And that in itself kind of makes this idea, one time there was this idea that, remember when they first discovered dinosaurs, they're all keen to tell you what they couldn't do. They couldn't do this and they couldn't do that, and when they got their tail bitten, they didn't know about it for a week or something, that's complete rubbish. And myelin is the thing that makes that complete rubbish. And so anyway, the interesting thing is that in normal animals, the myelination of the, say bonobos, chimpanzees, the myelination in the brain, that's the axons becoming myelinated, happens quite quickly as the animal grows. But in human beings, certain parts of the brain don't get myelinated very quickly. And I'll not go into the science behind it, but I personally drew a connection between our deep need for torsional when we came down from the trees and this fact that the myelination is delayed to a certain extent in our brains, certain parts of our brains. The particular parts of our brains, for instance, the limbic system, which is associated with what we would call the top line, the branches and leaves, and the prefrontal cortex, which is associated with more baseline, and also it's involved in behavior, in what we would call behavior in various ways. They tend to myelinate late, and the prefrontal cortex actually myelinates at the age of 25. It's the last thing to do so. So effectively, in biological terms, you and I, everybody, we cease to be a child at the age of 25. That's when our brain becomes mature. But of course, here again, example of the miasma. The miasma tells us, certainly in the UK, that we are adults at 18. And it treats us as such legally and other things. I remember when I was 18, I'll tell you now, there is no way I was an adult when I was 18. No way. Okay. I don't know about you, Joe, but no chance, right? Okay. But what's very, very interesting is the miasma, our society that we've created, treats us like we are adults at 18, but we're not adults until we're 25. So, biologically speaking. So you can see these kind of mismatches. These are also part of the miasma, these kind of mismatches. And there are very practical results to these mismatches. The average age of a first criminal conviction in Britain is around the age of 24, which means that that's actually an actual conviction, which means that the majority of actual first criminal offences committed are committed before the age of 24, when biologically you are not an adult, you're immature. And interestingly, these two last parts of the brain to switch on properly, to get fully developed, the limbic system and the frontal cortex, are exactly the parts of the brain that are involved in irresponsible behavior. So that would be another example of the miasma at work. People are adults when they're 18, and the body's kind of saying, oh no, I'm not. And society's like, oh yes, you are. Do it's quite interesting that people complained about having to be an adult at 21. I'd be happy to be an adult at 32, I tell you. I'd be happy not to have that worry,
It's like education as well in society, like everyone needs to be educated at the same age, and it's taken as an assumption that everybody can actually cope with that, you know?
So the miasma in one way is the expectations that society has of us that are sort of taken as read without being questioned. And that we kind of buy into ourselves. I talked about, the social promise, the idea that I get my head down, I work hard in school, I get good grades, and I go to university, I get a good degree, then I go into a company, I work hard, I make my way up through the ranks, I become a manager, I make lots of money, I buy a nice house, I buy a nice car, and then some amazingly attractive woman comes and attaches herself to me, and we have a beautiful family and live happily ever after. That's the promise of society. What I believe is that people make themselves unhappy. And I think a lot of people who turn to crime when they're very young, they want that. They want the money, they want the nice car, they want the stuff. And so because they can't find any way to actually emulate what society expects of them, they therefore go and steal that stuff rather than working for it. It's like the quick fix. But who made them want it in the first place, you know? And I come back to my favorite quote from Adam and the Ants. You know, at this point in my life, although it's many years later, you know, from that age, I kind of like this, what's the point of robbery when nothing's worth taking? You know, it's like, you know, do I really want that strange thing, you know, that's supposed to make me cool and everything, you know? Oh, a new pair of shoes, that'll make me feel amazing, you know?
Did you feel like you wanted all that at some point? I dim and distant past.
I guess I bought into it at some level. I certainly, as I talked about me wanting to be a technician, I certainly felt that was a good career. I've been told that interestingly, my various people around me had told me being a technician is a great career. There's always demand for technicians, and they get paid well, you know. So I bought into it at that level. I think I started to see other things, but it certainly wasn't binary. It wasn't like an overnight enlightenment. And there's another part of the miasma, you know.
Oh, yes.
This idea that spiritual enlightenment happens overnight when you sit and meditate under a tree. Oh, my goodness, you know. But just, anyway. So,
well, it's exactly the same for me. I mean, I just got told, go and do a physics degree. It was either physics or music, you know, pursue music with the arts and the creative stuff, or go and do physics. And it's like, Joseph, go and do physics because you earn lots of money.
Sure.
Yeah,
what
a colossal waste of time that was.
It's true. But I was also, you know, this is a podcast on shamanism, and there's something else we can warn people against at this point, which is topical. You will not achieve enlightenment instantly. That will not happen. It just won't. If you think it's happened, and I've met a few people, it's quite interesting. I don't want this to be a podcast slagging down Buddhism. We need to get onto the Buddhism podcast. But it's one of the interesting observations, because I've hung around a lot of Buddhists in my life. The humorous observations is that the proportion of Buddhists who I've met who have achieved enlightenment in the West is far higher than the number of Buddhists I've met who have achieved enlightenment in the Far East. I don't know what to say about that. Yeah. But anyway, there are good things. Don't get me wrong. There are good things in Buddhism, and we will come on to them. Yeah.
I think it takes time to be quote unquote enlightened, because, you know, the more I see it is everything's nuanced. There's not really many things in life that are black and white. Everything's got depth, and
but again, it's a word. Enlightenment is a word. It goes unchallenged. We make the assumption that it actually exists in the real world, and it's not a figment of our imagination. To me, as a shaman, as a shamanist, that's a dangerous assumption and should not go unchallenged. But anyway, one of the other things I wanted to say, which is very, very relevant to things we've discussed already, before we drift away from the subject of neurons and dendrites and axons and things, is this topic that we've touched on a few times now about my warnings about psychoactive substances, catalysts as I call them. Since we're on the subject of neurons, let's talk about how they work a little bit. So I can give a little bit of science behind my view on this. Obviously, my view on this comes out of direct experience, but what I would say is I have some science to back it up. The dendritic spines, if you like, the ears of the neurons, they receive messages from axons of other neurons, you know, and famously, the crazy number of dendrites can be linked to crazy numbers of other neurons for a single neuron, yeah? Thousands, yeah? So that's why the brain's so complicated. It's not just complicated in terms of the number of brain cells that we have. It's complicated in terms of the number of connections there are between those brain cells. And for many years, these connections, that's between the end of the termination of the axon. Actually, at the end of the axon, it also breaks up into lots of connections. But the termination at the end of the axon and the dendrite of the next neuron in the chain, we now know there's a gap. Early on, there was actually an argument as to whether there was a gap or not until somebody developed a microscope that was powerful enough to actually see the gap. And then it was virtually overnight, it was resolved one way or the other. There is a gap. Yeah. And the things that go across this gap, to transmit. So the action potential is reached, the signal is sent down the axon, tens of feet in terms of whales, down to the other end. It goes down lightning fast. Well, possibly lightning travels faster than 150 meters per second. I don't know, but it goes down very fast. It hits the other end, and then at the other end, things called neurotransmitters are released. There are lots of different neurotransmitters, but the one that particularly interests us is one called serotonin. This neurotransmitter goes across the gap and it hits the dendrite of the other neuron and it stimulates it. And then that neuron, then based on the signals it gets from this neuron and all the other neurons, decides whether it wants to initiate its action potential. Whether its action potential or not is met, and whether it passes on the signal or not. That's its thing. Yeah. And this is how our nervous system, how our brains work to a large extent. The problem, the benefit and problem with serotonin, as a neurotransmitter is you need quite a lot of it, and it has to, you have to, because you don't want to run out of it. Lots and lots of unpleasant psychological problems arise if you start running out of these neurotransmitters. So the body, in order to get around that problem, that it's a bad idea to run out of serotonin, has made it from a relatively simple, people are probably aware organic molecules can be ridiculously complex. A relatively simple amino acid called tryptophan, which is widely used in the body anyway. For an organic molecule, it's pretty simple. That doesn't mean it's a simple molecule, it just means by organic molecule standards, it's pretty simple. And it can be easily created and easily used. The problem when you make something simple like that is that it can also be easily mimicked. If you think of the traditional thing that's used in biology as a lock and a key, the neurotransmitter is like the key, and the receptor on the dendrite of the next neuron is like the lock, and the key fits in the lock. And the problem with not just serotonin but lots of these neurotransmitters is they're quite simple, and that means the key is simple. One of these locks you get on the front of a children's toy where there's just like a peg and you turn it in. This is not a highly secure lock you would put on a safe in a bank. This is just like something you'd put on the front of like a piggy bank or something, and so that means they're very, very easy to mimic, or even accidentally mimicked. And a large range of plants, either deliberately or accidentally. I'll let you read if you want to. My view is that judgment is, or my own judgment is out on that subject. I think if you read McKenna's book, you'll think that he leans towards there being nothing accidental about that. I believe there could be something accidental about it. But I wouldn't, in terms of botanical, I bow to his wisdom here. So things like LSD, peyote, which is a mescaline, DMT, ayahuasca, all these kind of things, they all mimic serotonin, and it's not, biologically speaking, it's not a particularly difficult thing to do. So when you consume or take on these chemicals, they get into your bloodstream and they get into the fluid, they get into your brain, they get into the fluid that's in the synaptic gap. And what they start doing is they start going into the lock on the dendrite that's made for the serotonin, and they start artificially stimulating it, even though there was no transmission from the previous neuron in the chain. Now, what this does, as you said when we're talking about Tyrak one time, what this does is it does put you into a non-ordinary state of consciousness. It does do that, yeah. But it absolutely does not of itself impart knowledge or wisdom, and the assertion that they provide of themselves any kind of insight is absolutely false. They are providing false stimulation. That's what they're doing. So the idea that's rife in the shamanistic community, certainly in the West, that they do provide such insight is in itself part of the miasma. Knowledge or wisdom in shamanistic technique comes from exactly that. It comes from shamanic technique. That's where the knowledge or wisdom comes from. It absolutely does not come from organic molecules that mimic serotonin. So this is why I said, when you see these things as a tool. If you have the discipline to overcome, the discipline and the training and the direction to overcome the negative effect that they will make you visualize and see and feel things that are not real and have nothing to do with the real world because of their activity of falsely stimulating neurons. If you have the discipline to overcome that, you can leverage the positive, which is they help you to quickly put yourself into a state of non-ordinary consciousness. And you can, if you want, use that as a facilitator of your shamanic technique, which if you do it correctly and well, and with Bat, Guchach, and Toshaltin, will provide you the wisdom and knowledge that some people allege comes from the serotonin mimics, and actually comes not from the serotonin mimics, but comes from the shamanic technique itself. So there's a biological explanation.
Could you put an opinion across then as to, because I think, a few people might have tried them, and maybe if they have, when you're in that state, you do become quite self-reflective. You start thinking about our place in the world and things like that. So,
sure.
What is it about?
That's
about
what I said.
The thoughts.
That's what I said. That what I said the previous time we discussed them is they do give rise to things because these neurons activate in chains. Just because the false activation happened at the first stage in the chain doesn't mean that the enormously complex chain after that won't seemingly throw up something new, because this is an enormously complex subject. You know, the biological basis of the brain and how it works is huge complexity. A little stimulation at one end can give rise to some genuine processing, some genuine neurological activity that does things that it possibly wouldn't have done based on that processing. But any result that comes out of that chain came from inside of you. It did not come from outside of you. The thing that makes stuff come from outside of you is the shamanic technique itself. Anything, so, you know, people have things hidden inside of them that might want to come out, and these things can do that, yeah? But that is not shamanism. It doesn't mean that they might not find it of value, especially if they're an artist, you know, if they're a sort of, if somebody's an abstract artist, you know, maybe that kind of thing is going to be really good for them, for the kind of thing they want to achieve. But shamanism is absolutely not about imagining and inventing things. Shamanism is about deriving knowledge, wisdom, or insight into the real world that provides you with an advantage over somebody who doesn't have that insight. That's what shamanism is about. So all I would say is, yes, that does happen. It can make you reflective. It can bring things out of you that are that wouldn't have come out in the normal course of events. Absolutely, that can happen. And maybe you'll find some insight about yourself through that. But what I'm saying is, through that by itself, without the associated shamanic technique and the shamanic discipline, it will tell you nothing about the world outside of you, though you will probably believe that it does.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when I'm in that state, I can kind of, I feel like I can see the miasma a little bit more clearly, and kind of get a grasp of our disconnect with nature.
But what remember,
but, you know, I'm under no illusions that that's not shamanism at that stage. It's purely the psychoactive substances doing their thing, but it's recreational. It's not. It doesn't mean anything as far as shamanism is concerned.
But you know, you've been involved in shamanism a while now. There will be some, you know, I don't want to use the word subconscious, but there will be some shamanic technique going on in that experience, because, as you know, shamanic technique is much more varied than people think it is. So you may be doing some shamanic technique without thinking that you are, and you may be deriving something from that. But the point is, without the bat, without the bird, Shikatarate, you will not be able to distinguish between what is and isn't coming from outside of you. And therefore, your knowledge will be less useful. Your insight and your knowledge thus derived, it may contain something from outside of you, but you won't be able to distinguish, and therefore it'll be far less useful.
Well, I think I'll kind of end this discussion of psychoactive substances by saying one thing, which maybe a few others would relate to. I mean, the very first time I experienced this was a great experience. I mean, you know the deal. It's off to mushroom land, and everything looks pretty and nice, and you can kind of contemplate things in a whole new light, and it's all good. And I could definitely see that people could have that experience and kind of come away thinking that they are, I don't know, quote unquote enlightened, or they have a newfound understanding and respect for nature and things around them and stuff like that. This to me is the recreational effects, and I don't personally see anything wrong with it, so long as it's taken as such and not taken as anything more than that. It's a positive experience. But then I tried it again after practicing the exercises you taught me for a month or two, and I thought, ooh, I wonder what will happen if I tried these exercises as well in that state. And all I can say is there is a difference, a huge difference between the two.
Well, remember we talked about the Nechdel, the higher level of shamanism. Probably we're jumping ahead a long way, but what happens when you practice a lot of shamanistic technique? A lot of it hangs with you in the same way the spirit animal hangs with you after you've been absorbing its essence in a state of chillicity. It hangs with you, and you get to the point where you can't not do shamanic technique. You couldn't not do it even if you wanted to. And I suspect that's what you're referring to.
Cool. So, do you want to call this episode right now, or should we?
I think it's a good point. That's I guess about an hour.
Yeah, because there's loads more to. I mean, I've got my show notes in front of me right here. There's loads more that we want to talk about.
You're not kidding, Joe. The problem with these things is with the miasma is we are going to have to draw a line under it sometime.
That's been a nice introduction on it. Yeah,
we'll be on to the miasma episode 57. You know, but I don't feel ready to draw that line yet.
No, let's do at least another one, maybe another two.
Sure.
Because there's loads more I want to ask you about the miasma, loads more in the notes, so we'll do that.
Yeah. Okay, right. That's good with me.
Fantastic. So look forward to the next episode. I hope you got something out of this episode. We'll pick this up right where we left off next episode, in episode 14, which will be our second on the miasma. Thanks so much for listening. Head on over to the website, wovenenergy.com. You can sign up to the mailing list over there. You can grab yourself a Get Started episode over there as well, which is really useful. It's got some exercises in there and some techniques for you to try. So head over there, sign up to the mailing list. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Joe.